Very much, appreciate it. Yes, and I would also like to say not only thanks to you, but thanks to the entire ham radio community for really welcoming me into your fold over these last few years, and especially to not only AMSAT and ARIS for specifically bringing me out here this trip. This is actually my first Hamvention. It's actually the largest ham gathering I've ever been to. The only other thing I've been to is local club meetings in Austin, Texas. So this is a particular thrill for me to get a chance to come out and really see the ham community in all its glory. What's interesting for me is that even though as was mentioned, my father, W5LFL, who's sitting back over here, Owen Garriott, and so I have very young childhood memories of him and my grandfather talking on ham radios, but when I finally committed to my own space flight in the spring of 2007, I knew that I wouldn't be very much of a good son if I made it all the way to space and didn't do some ham radio work while I was there. So I went out with some sense of urgency to go get my own license and applied for my grandfather's call sign so that I could kind of do the reversal of family history there and make a contact back to my father almost exactly 25 years to the day. I flew within about a couple of weeks actually of the 25th anniversary. And so my flight to space, of course, as you might imagine, was phenomenal. The preparations for space flight, where I spent about a year in Russia, was of course a great joy. Of course, there's nothing that beats the day you wake up in the morning, put on your own custom-made spacesuit, go out to a fully fueled rocket that every sane person is getting as far away from as possible. My dad actually got to be with me there at the base of the conning tower as I crawled up to climb on board that rocket. He also got to run my ground control team in Russia for the 2 weeks that I was in orbit. He took a little time off to head out to the ham shack over at the Gagarin Cosmonaut Training Center so we could make our ham contact from space, and he was also there with the rescue teams that picked me up by helicopter. So it was actually this year for us has been a great opportunity to share experiences that he has had a long history of doing, but as the relative newcomer, it was really a great joy for me to participate in. But I have to tell you that I did a lot of things in orbit. I did a lot of scientific research, commercial work, a lot of educational outreach, a lot of Earth observations photography. I did a wide variety of different things at a very, very full schedule. But I've not been shy about saying something that is very, very true, which is that the ham radio activities that I did in space were by far the most personally fulfilling and challenging and interesting activities that I did with my time in space. And the reason that's true is because of all of you. And I'd like to just tell you a couple little snippets, little pieces of stories about my ham radio activities in space, which is why I really think this is so true. For example, before I flew in space, I created a series of images to transmit via a software slow scan TV program that included things like some fairly irreverent things, like some test patterns and eye color tests and pirate flags. And the pirate flag said things that says like Richard Garriott's mutiny on the ISS. And the NASA folks that I was working with were a little bit worried that they were kind of saying, Richard, we're really just not sure you should be quite that irreverent when you're sending messages down from space. And so they almost talked me out of it. But fortunately, right when I got on board, the first thing I did is I set up my workstation. I set up the ham radio gear. I hooked the VCH1 and the laptop up to the Kenwood. And while I was busy doing other things, I transmitted that first slideshow. And I was kind of going, okay, well, I wonder how people are going to, react to these first images from space. And I immediately, back on orbit, got feedback that everybody really got it. That they understood the pattern of images that I was sending, and they seemed to really kind of appreciate the spirit in which that first transmission was meant. The next kind of cool thing that happened with ham radio was when I hooked up the VCH1. As many of you probably know, that device operates off batteries, and we didn't have a way to connect it into the ISS power grid, and so there's only a limited number of batteries on orbit. So I was wanting to be fairly conservative with my battery utilization, and the ARIS teams had already worked out. They'd already done ground testing, and determined that batteries would last about 4 hours on orbit. And I did a mental calculation and thought, well, if I leave this thing running basically for 2 weeks, I'm going to use up all the batteries that exist on the station, so I don't want to, chow through the battery supply that badly, that quickly. And so I said, I'm going to stretch it out. I'm going to run the VCH1 and basically until it looks to me it's no longer working, and then I'll change out the batteries. So that's what I did on day one, is I powered it up, aimed it out the window, and let it rip. And to me, it appeared that the batteries lasted, 8 or 10 hours. And then finally I would change them 8 or 10 hours later. Well, the next morning I have a morning daily planning conference with my father. Next morning, I get a call from my dad on the ground that says, "Hey, Richard, the ham radio users around the globe, on the one hand, are very appreciative of the many pictures you're sending down. On the other hand, they have noticed that you are running the batteries past their prescribed limit. And in fact, after 4 to 4.5 hours, the quality of your transmission is going dead, and it is requested and encouraged that you actually change the batteries out more frequently." And I'm going like, how in the world these people even know that this is what's happening on board? And I'm going through my head, I'm going like, for people on the ground to have not only figured this out, that means that there's people around the globe watching to where the person who's getting the bad signals in a different part of the world than the person who received the good transmission. So they're having to not only notice that the transmission went bad, but they're well coordinated enough to figure out when it failed, to realize that it's been 4 to 4.5 hours that the batteries in fact are lasting on orbit. And then they not only figured that out, but then they figured out how to communicate back to my father, who's in Russian mission control, to get the message up to me in space, less than a day later. And I'm going like, oh, I'm in trouble. Because, these guys are obviously paying a lot of attention. They're extraordinarily technically savvy. And boy, I'd better do a good job or I'm going to, be a family embarrassment here, if I'm not careful. And so I became devoted to doing a good job of ham radio in space. And then the next thing that occurred is this is the actually these 2 notebooks are my crew notebooks that I actually flew into space. And so this is all my cheat sheets, for how to operate all the equipment, life support, radios, etc. And in here on page 63 of my personal crew notebook was the page that I put in here for recording all of my QSOs. My one page for recording all of my QSOs. And so as soon as I powered up the radio here at 14:25 on October 14th, in about 3 minutes, I basically filled the page. And then I realized, yet again, I was in trouble. And I thought, oh gosh, I've completely underprepared for this eventuality. And so I went to my other notebook where I had made printouts of all my orbital paths so that I could know what parts of the world was over at various times. And so for example, on October 16th, you can see that I have 2 columns of contacts that I just wrote on the back of that sheet of paper, just needing a place to transcribe all these. Well, as I became more efficient at making these contacts, I also realized, a little ways into it, I realized, wow, I'm actually getting quite a few of these. I kind of did a rough count, and I knew I was at least in the hundreds. And I was going, my dad was up for 2 weeks, about the same amount of time that I'm up in space. I don't know how many contacts he logged, but it would sure be nice to beat him. And so then I said, I need to make sure I log I really want to get as many as I can. So I started spending as much time as I could on the ham radio and trying to be very efficient with all of my contacts. And so you can see here, where on the 16th I had 2 columns. By the 20th I'm up to 4 columns on the sheet of paper. By the time I left, I had 5 columns, and I was running over onto extra sheets of paper further into my logbook. So I was working hard to make as many contacts as I could, and I came down with when I took this notebook down. I've got 518 two-way QSOs that I can match up, or I've found everybody's call sign and names that match what I had on orbit. I'm sure I have more than that I'll get figured out. In fact, I've been figuring out a lot more here while I'm here and talking with people who've been actually coming into my notebook to find their call signs here. But I think my dad said he had 100 or 2 is the number. So I think I think I may have a record for short duration flights for the number of contacts that were made. I put a fair bit of time into it, so hopefully that record will stand for a little while. But I have to tell you though that all of the contacts I made with the ham community were incredibly, while brief, were incredibly meaningful to me. It was really obvious that the community that I was talking to from space were, again, I've already mentioned technically savvy, but very enthusiastic, very appreciative of the contacts that were made from space. Very helpful in the sense of if I was trying to make school contacts, or if I heard a child's voice or somebody mentioned they were a principal at a school somewhere, and I were to announce that I really wanted to speak to this call sign or this fragment of a call sign that I heard from space, especially here in the United States, the rest of the community would all kind of settle down in the normal log jam that would often be coming up to space and clear the airways for me to make that contact with the target or individuals or schools that I was really trying to make contact with. And I was incredibly impressed. I mean, I was frankly just incredibly moved by the response that I received during my time in space. But unfortunately, after I was up in space for 12 days and 10 of those on the ISS, and all good things must come to an end, so to speak. And eventually, on the late night on October 23rd, we undocked with the ISS and touched down in Kazakhstan on October 24th. And I have to tell you that as exciting as launch is, and as exciting as the 12 days in space was as well, the re-entering the Earth's atmosphere, traveling 17,000 miles an hour, is another pretty monumental day. It's as the vehicle enters, as you guys probably know, most of you being in the satellite side of things, you're aware of the fact that that's fast enough to rip molecules apart and create a plasma that's basically the temperature of the sun just outside your window, and the vehicle you're in is basically melting away, and fragments of the heat shield are flying by the window right beside you. That's a pretty interesting period of time, you might say. And but surprisingly, it's a very non-threatening. It's very quiet and smooth, and very surprisingly non-threatening, you might say. But then in the Russian side, once the parachute opens, you get a bit of a whip cracking as the parachute opens up. You then have a fairly gentle ride down to the Earth. But the Russians, as you may know, as opposed to landing like the old Apollo capsules did in the ocean, they land on the land. And so that the finale of your time in space is a ka-wump when you hit the ground traveling 20 or 30 miles an hour in a 6,000-pound vehicle that not only hits with a pretty good thud, but it actually bounces and rolls for a while. And the good news is you're in a form-fitted seat that's got shock absorbers and you're strapped in good and tight, so it's actually completely comfortable to the passenger. But the visuals around you inside the vehicle is pretty impressive. But so on October 24th, my 12 days in space ended. But my journey in space, and my journey with the ham community, I really think has just started. I mean, it's been a really wonderful experience for me to continue then to, when I was doing my research, to track down all these call signs. I would sometimes have fragments and send emails to people, and whether they were the actual person I contacted or I was off track, people would always redirect me back correctly into the community and help me track down the people I made contact with. I've started building great relationships with the people I contacted from space. I've met 2 or 3 dozen of them here this weekend already. The schools that I contacted from space, I've gone back and visited those schools, at least a few of them already, and it's really clear the impact of the way this has touched those kids has also been very, very meaningful. And so for me, anyway, as the junior member of the club, so to speak, but somebody who got to have a more interesting than usual beginning to my journey through ham radio, I would like to just say thank you all so very much for welcoming me into your community and making me feel like such a valued member of the team so quickly. So thank you. Question, questions? So, yeah.
Marshall Space Center. Which Garriott was the head of marketing out of Alabama, Huntsville, Alabama?
My father has been over at the Huntsville, Alabama Space Center since he retired as an astronaut. Is there one other question, maybe? Okay. Well, I'll be outside nearby and over at the AMSAT or Aris booth if you want to chat later too. So thank you again.